Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the channel today. I'm Ted Yacucci. Well, way back in 1963, there was an executive order that was issued by President Lyndon Johnson, and that executive order was number 11130. That executive order had a lot to do with how we all kind of look at our government for the last 60 plus years. That's because that executive order issued by President Johnson was the creation of the Warren Commission. Now, when was it issued? It was issued on November 29th, 1963. November 29th, 1963, that's only 7 days after the assassination of President Kennedy in Dealey Plaza. It's only 5 days after the murder of Lee Oswald in the basement of the Dallas City Jail by Jack Ruby. So 5 days after the murder of Lee Oswald, the prime suspect in the murder of the President of the United States, President Johnson issues an executive order creating the Warren Commission. Why would he do it so quickly? Well, that's really easy when you take the time to actually examine the Warren Commission report, which came out the following year. Because even though the Warren commissioners wanted us to believe that it was an exhaustive look at all of the events surrounding the assassination of President Kennedy, what it really was a cover up, a massive cover up of most of the important elements that took place both in the lead up to the assassination and during the assassination. And what I mean by that is that the Warren Commission, if you take the time to read the report, you realize it's a total sham created by number one, Alan Dulles, one of the main conspirators in the assassination itself. It's almost incredible when you think about it. It had people like Arlen Specter, a junior counselor, who would create the magic bullet theory out of thin air. It had, and then go on to be a United States senator for his actions there. He was supported. It had actions like moving the back wound from 5 inches down in the back up to the back of the neck. By who? By Gerald Ford, who would be rewarded with what? With the presidency of the United States. The Warren Commission changed testimony. The Warren Commission added testimony. It made up testimony. It deleted testimony when it didn't fit their lone nut scenario. And we're going to look at just a couple of examples of some of the most egregious actions of the Warren Commission today, just to kind of reinforce just how much of a sham that commission really was and how much of a sham that message of the lone nut shooter really was when it was put out to the American public. And let's start with our friend Arlen Specter, brought in as one of the junior counsels to the Warren Commission and also the man who would become a United States Senator from the state of Pennsylvania. It was Specter's leadership that created the magic bullet theory, in which 3 shots were attributed to Lee Harvey Oswald from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. And of course, one of those shots was supposed to have caused 7 separate wounds in President Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally. Well, it all comes back to being able to, and then of course that bullet was found supposedly after rolling off a stretcher at Parkland Hospital. Well, it all comes down to identifying that bullet and if it could have caused indeed that many wounds to both men, right? Well, it should be easy then because the bullet was found. So it should be easy to do the analysis. So let's just go real quickly over the chronology. The bullet was found by an engineer at the hospital, and that was Daryl Tomlinson. He said he moved some stretchers and then picked up the bullet when it fell off of a stretcher. He called in some help. That happened to be personnel director at Parkland Hospital, O.P. Wright. From there, they gave the bullet to a Secret Service agent who was in the hospital. That was Richard Johnson. He took the bullet to Washington, gave it to James Rowley, the chief of the Secret Service. Rowley gave the bullet to FBI agent Elmer Lee Todd, who carried it to Robert Frazier in the FBI's crime lab. Okay, so we have those people who are involved. Now, listen to this. Not one of those people, not one will identify CE 399, which is the bullet that supposedly the Warren Commission named it CE 399, supposedly did all that damage. Not one of those men will identify CE 399, the bullet that is currently in the National Archives, as the bullet that they found or handled that day in November 1963. Let me say that again because it's really important. Not one of those men will identify CE 399 as the bullet that they found at Parkland Hospital. So, how does the Warren Commission handle this? How could they possibly handle this? Well, it's really interesting because our inspector, he goes to Parkland Hospital to interview Tomlinson and Wright, and of course he interviews some other people too. So does he ask the question, is the bullet that you found that day, is it CE 399? He does not. Let me say it again. He does not ask the question. Is the bullet CE 399? Is that the bullet that you found? He knows he can't ask that question because Daryl Tomlinson and O.P. Wright and Richard Johnson, the Secret Service agent, they've already stated that it's not the bullet. So he can't ask that question. So what does he do? He spends all his time asking how the bullet came off the stretcher. How did you bump the stretchers? Was it stretcher A or stretcher B? He doesn't ask the question. Okay, now let's move to, my favorite subject. If you guys are familiar with the channel, that's Ruth Payne. Ruth Payne, the Warren Commission asked her over 5,000 questions. They rely on her testimony to set their worldview of Lee Oswald and Marina Oswald, right? Well, let's go back to the beginning and let's look at Ruth Payne just a little bit because we know that Ruth Payne's husband, Michael Payne, from a very wealthy family, then that family has their family compound at Nonchon Island. Well, who else is a frequent visitor besides Ruth and Michael Payne, who summer there and spend a lot of other time there by admission? But who else is a frequent visit there? No one else but CI director Alan Dulles, because he's having an affair. He's having an affair with the best friend of Michael Payne's mother. So he's at that compound a lot on Nonchon Island, and the Michael and Ruth Payne, of course, are there also. Very familiar with each other, right? So, how does the Warren Commission handle this? I mean, is Alan Dulles, is he going to recuse himself as you might expect? Not only does he not recuse himself, but they pretend that they have no idea who each other is when they start the testimony. So at nowhere are we told that Alan Dulles and Ruth Payne have probably been together many, many times and have a relationship. Okay. Now it gets a lot worse because as you go through the testimony, everyone that Ruth Payne is asked about, and I mean everybody, when she takes her trip from New Orleans. I'm sorry, excuse me, from Dallas to Nonshawn Island, and then she goes back to New Orleans to pick up Marina Oswald and take her back to live with her at Dallas. Everyone who she came in contact with on that trip in the summer of 1963 is asked about in exquisite detail by the Warren Commission. That's all her uncles and relatives and family and everybody that she came in contact with, right? Well, all of a sudden, she doesn't mention one person, and that person is her sister named Sylvia Hoke, who has been a psychologist with the CIA, working with the CIA in Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. since 1950, either 52 or 54. I'm sorry, I can't remember right now. Okay. So for at least 9 years, she's been employed as a psychologist for the CIA. How does the Warren Commission get around this? Like they do everything else, they just don't ask her. After they've asked the intensive background of everyone else that she's came in contact with on that summer trip, when it comes to Ruth Payne, all they say is, did you see your sister in Washington, D.C.? She says, yes, I did. And I also saw Michael, her husband's brother, or something like that. They don't ask even one more question. Why would that be? A CIA agent, a CIA psychologist that Ruth Payne has spent days and days with immediately before leaving Northern Virginia and going to New Orleans to pick up Marina Oswald. Just absolutely incredible. Next, let's do a quick one, and that is the testimony of National Scripps Howard reporter Seth Caner, who had a conversation with nobody else but Jack Ruby at Parkland Hospital immediately after the assassination when the doctors were working on President Kennedy in Trauma Room 1. So, Seth Caner is there. He's trying to get as much information as he can. Very, very prolific reporter. Jack Ruby comes up to him. They have a conversation. Jack Ruby asks, "Oh my gosh, he looks disturbed. You think I should close my clubs for a couple of days, in respect?" And Seth Caner says, "Yeah, I think that'd be a good idea." They shake hands. Call each other by name. Well, how does the Warren Commission handle this? Because, they say that Jack Ruby, no way he could be at Parkland Hospital because they don't want anybody thinking that he could have planted that bullet on the stretcher, of course, right? Well, they say that Seth Caner must have been mistaken. Can you believe that? A National Scripps Howard reporter, and they just say, well, it doesn't really fit in with our plans here with our report. So you must have been mistaken. You must have run into Jack Ruby somewhere else, right? Later on. And Cantor says, this made me, as soon as I read this, it made me think, who else's testimony have they changed? How could they possibly have done this? All right, so that's another example, right? Then, of course, my favorite. Let's move on to another one. How about Lee Bowers, who of course is the railroad supervisor? He's up in his tower, overlooking the parking lot and the railroad tracks during the time of the assassination. He can see the parking lot. He's seen three cars come in there in the 25 minutes or so before the assassination. He's seen the second car, the driver on an obvious telephone or walkie-talkie or some kind of communications advice as he's driving slowly around the parking area. More importantly, he's heard the second and third shot almost on top of each other. No way they could have come from a single shooter. He's also seen a puff of smoke that he thinks from, and he's seen stuff too. He doesn't have a wonderful look at the grassy knoll area from where he is, but he says he's seen, definitely some visual action when he's also heard the shots coming from the grassy knoll. Okay, so that's really, really important because Oswald has a bolt action rifle, right? So he's got to rack the bolt and take time. There's no way you can shoot a rifle like that, without a couple of seconds going by between shots, right? So if Lee Bowers did hear shots almost on top of each other, like he said and did tell the FBI multiple times, in the weeks after the assassination, then the Warren Commission has a bad problem because the whole Lee Oswald firing three shots from the book depository goes the way, out the window, right? So, how do they handle it? When Lee Bowers gets to the Warren Commission, they just don't ask him about it. That's exactly what they will do again with so many witnesses that they can't ask the critical questions of. So they just don't ask him. When they get to that part in his story, they just skip it. They start asking him questions about other things. They never ask him, did you hear those shots one on top of each other? How quickly did you hear the shots? They just don't ask it. All right, let's move to an even a very similar situation in which we know we've had Roger Craig and Seymour Weitzman, another Dallas police officer, and another police officer whose name I just can't remember right now. They've all seen Mauser on the when they found the gun in the Texas School Book Depository sniper's nest. Lieutenant Day is there, the guy that will later claim that he found a palm print on the barrel of the rifle, after the FBI has examined it in Washington and then sent it back. So, all three of these guys see Mauser. They're looking right at it, okay? So they do an affidavit, the Weitzman affidavit, David, and the other officer. So and they say, it was a Mauser. We looked at it, it was a 7.65 Mauser, right? So, how does the Warren Commission handle this? They've got to say, hey, in front of me now, I have an affidavit that you signed on the day of the assassination saying that you saw the word Mauser stamped on the barrel of that rifle found in the sniper's nest. Is that accurate? Was it a Mauser? Did you see the word Mauser stamped on it? They don't ask the question. I mean, is that not the most obvious reason to believe that the Warren Commission didn't really want the truth? They never asked any of those three officers that question. Did you see it? I have the affidavit that you signed. Did you see it? They never asked the question because they knew the answer to the question would have been yes, I saw Mauser stamped on that barrel. All right, let's move to another example. And of course, this is really one of the critical examples, and that's Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford, who went to the FBI's Carla DeRoche before the commission actually started hearing testimony and offered to be a stool pigeon, an informer for the FBI. That's the kind of person that Congressman at that time, Gerald Ford, was, right? So what did he do? What critical role did he play in the Warren Commission? Well, what he did, and this is again right before the Warren Commission report went to print, our buddy Gerald Ford moved the back wound from 5 inches down from the neck in JFK's back. He moved it up 5 inches. 5 inches, that wound, and called it a back of the neck wound. And then That, of course, caused a lot of mix up because if the wound had been reported accurately as 5 inches down in the back from the neck, then no way that shot could have been misconstrued as the throat, an exit wound in the throat. Okay. So that, of course, would have killed the whole Warren Commission lone nut shooter theory. Okay. And he held on to that until he couldn't anymore. And then when he finally, right before he passed, he tried to justify it by saying he was just trying to make it clear. That's not trying to make it clearer, folks. That's trying to obfuscate the truth. That's trying to lie. And he did an awfully good job of that. And he was certainly rewarded very well for his actions. Another good example, of course, of the Warren Commission and how much of a sham they really were was that they just didn't interview people who would have refuted their lone nut theory. And, a great example of this is the 4 or 5 or 6 people like Mr. Arnold Rowland and his wife who all saw two people in the sixth floor of the Texas School Book Depository with a rifle, and that was 15 minutes before the actual shots rang out, which means it would have had to have been a conspiracy, more than one people, even if you somehow believe that Lee Oswald was one of those people, which of course he wasn't, but even if you believe that, all of these people all of these people reported and said, they were so anxious to testify, but they were never called by the Warren Commission because the Warren Commission could not have had that testimony that said there were multiple people seen in that sixth floor only 15 minutes before the shots rang out. And of course, we know that the investigation into Jack Ruby was, ridiculously curtailed and portrayed by the Warren Commission. Everyone knew that Jack Ruby was a gun runner to both Batista and Castro in Cuba and had been for years for both the CIA and the mafia. Everyone knew that he was a gun distributor for a lot of the armories that had been burglarized in the United States in the year before the assassination. And he was a middleman in providing a lot of the arms that were stolen from those armories to anti-Castro Cubans who at that time were training illegally at Lake Pontchartrain and other training sites around the country. So how did the Warren Commission handle this? They just minimized everything. They never mentioned any of the gun running. They said things were rumors. They said that he was just a small time, hood or person or bar owner who had a need for some psychological grandiosity, the same baloney that they would say about Lee Oswald, right? Again, everybody that had started to do any kind of investigation would have known the truth about Jack Ruby immediately. And that's just a great, great incidence of just covering up the truth. If it doesn't fit your scenario, the Warren Commission just covered it up. And another example, another really good example is Julia Ann Mercer. Julia Ann Mercer testified before the Warren Commission that she saw Jack Ruby drop off some people that she thought were shooters at the Dilley Plaza about an hour before the assassination. She picked out a picture of Jack Ruby on Saturday before Ruby was known for shooting Lee Oswald the next day on a Sunday, and she testified to this before the Warren Commission. She also said that it was a truck with no writing on it, and she was very explicit. in her and detailed in her testimony. Well, what did the Warren Commission do? They changed it. They changed her testimony. They said that she thought it might have been someone that looked like Jack Ruby. They didn't say she picked him out before the next day, Sunday. They said there was writing on the truck refrigeration or something, so that that would throw off all the people that would be searching for that green truck that Julia Ann Mercer actually described. I haven't actually read the that testimony in a while, so it's not really fresh in my head. But what they did was they changed it all, and that's again what they did with so many of the witnesses. They would just change it, and they didn't need sometimes to change huge parts of it. They would just change little critical things, which would have made it impossible for, in this case, Julianne Mercer's testimony to maybe be accurate or to cause people to question it a lot more. And of course, she told her story when the movie JFK was coming out to director Oliver Stone. And that's when a lot of people, became aware of that whole story. Again, it's just another example of the Warren Commission either lying or changing or deleting or just totally not asking about any type of evidence or actions that didn't fit their lone nut scenario. They were liars. They were part of the murder, part of the assassination of President Kennedy. And for some of those junior counselors to come in, they had to know really, really quickly what they were doing in covering up all of this evidence and lying about all this evidence and changing all this evidence. So there's no excuse. There's no excuse for any of them. And to have someone like Alan Dulles fired for lying to President Kennedy 2 years prior, but someone who was still really running the CIA from his townhouse in Georgetown, and then someone who was at the farm at Northern Virginia for the whole week that President Kennedy was assassinated, and then to run down and make sure that he became the de facto head of the Warren Commission. There's no question, folks. That's why I say when people can't believe how massive this assassination and cover up was, I know it's difficult if you don't spend a lot of time really researching it, but it doesn't take a lot of time when you start researching to realize that there was an extreme right-wing shadow government that was in existence, and they did get away. And with the assassination of the President of the United States, they got the Vietnam War, they kept their drug running in Southeast Asia, and they really created an environment where they were able to promote people like Arlen Specter and Gerald Ford and a lot of the other people that were complicit in the Warren Commission's sham. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll do more videos on this, and we'll look at a lot of other examples that aren't as well known. I just needed to get these off my chest today because I happen to be thinking about it. Thanks so much for watching the channel. Please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Have a great day, everybody.